Hey grade 12s, today we're going to take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of the different measures of central tendency. So we've already talked about mean, median, mode, weighted mean, trimmed mean, and we're going to take a look at where, in which situations each is useful, and in which situations they may or may not be useful. So let's take a look at what we've looked at and the relative merits. The mean. Its advantages, it's useful for describing data if the data has no outliers, and of course we know those outliers are really high or really low values. The disadvantage is it doesn't represent a typical outcome, and outliers can have a tremendous effect on the mean. Okay? The median is useful for describing typical values, such as house prices. Outliers don't have much or any effect on the median. However, it is time consuming to write all the numbers in order, especially if you've got a whole whack of them. And if there's a gap between values and it's too big or too small, the median could be inaccurate. So you have to be careful at being aware of what the distribution of the numbers is. What about the mode? Outliers have very little, if any, effect on the mode, except if the outlier is itself the mode. It can be used for nominal data. In other words, if I was to ask what your favorite video game is, that's not a numerical response. But because you're giving me an answer, we can use the mode to tally the winner. For that reason, if you're doing an election, the mode is the measure of central tendency that is used to represent the winner of the election, the person with the most votes. What are the disadvantages? Well, if the mode is really far from the middle of the data, then it could give an inaccurate representation of the data. And what if the mode doesn't exist? Or what if there's several modes? And what if those several modes are very, very different? Then all of a sudden you don't really get a good picture of what the data is. We also talked about the trimmed mean. The trimmed mean is usually resistant to outliers. And if the data has skewed values on the left or right, it's a good way of combating that, and it gives a reasonable estimate of the center of the data. But if there's several outliers, like more than 5% in a given direction, the trimmed mean may include outliers and therefore be a less effective measure of central tendency. And last but not least, the weighted mean. The weighted mean is useful when individual data represents multiple people. And it's also useful when there's a sample when a sample either over or under represents parts of the population. And it's also useful when some values in your data are less accurate. The disadvantages? Well, it could be biased if arbitrary weights are given to the data. Now, what does that mean? Well, um, let's say that if we looked at your mark in this class, and this isn't the way your mark is evaluated, but let's say I gave you, I don't know, let's say that 80% of your mark was based on quiz marks. That would not be a very wise move on my part. So what you have to do is you do have to be careful uh, that the weights are appropriate. Okay? Now, if we're talking customers, or rather number of employees with salary, then those weights are going to be fine. But if we're talking about your mark in a class, then the weights have to make sense. That's basically what it boils down to. I am going to orient my board here because it is acting a little funny here. I don't know if this will show up to you guys, but I do want to make sure that it is going to be effective for me when I do these written examples. There we go. And let's do an example here. Consider the following test scores that Darren gets, and they're all out of 100: 0, 0, 0, 60, 64, 67, 72, and 98. Which measure of central tendency would best represent the typical mark Darren gets on a test? Well, the thing is that the outlier here is 0. So because of that, the mean would be no good because of the outlier. The mode, no good because it is the outlier. If we thought about the trimmed mean, we have to have at least 10 pieces of data. In fact, no, actually, to do it on both ends, we have to actually have at least 20 pieces of data. So it's no good because we don't have enough numbers. No good because not enough data. We're not talking about weighted mean here because there's no weights here. So that leaves one solitary measure of central tendency left, and that is the median. So the median is appropriate. Can we test that hypothesis? Well, we have 8 numbers, and we have 2 numbers that live in the middle. If we add those 2 numbers and we divide by 2, we're going to get 62. Is 62 a typical number? Well, 3 of the numbers are in the 60s. One of them is just over the 60s. So I'd say that since 4 of the 8 numbers are within 12% of one another, that 62 is probably a pretty typical number to represent the data, and that 62 itself is a good measure of central tendency. Okay? All right. A newspaper conducts a survey on their customers and claims that the median age of people who access a newspaper on a tablet is 47. The median age of people who access the newspaper in print form is 68. Which median best represents the typical age of a customer best? Explain why. Well, to do this question, I guess what we have to do is we have to think of who the typical customer is of a newspaper. And if we think about that, like, is there going to be more people reading it on a tablet, smartphone, or something like that, or somebody that actually accesses the newspaper physically? More than likely, I would say that there's probably a small minority that probably look at a newspaper on a tablet, but because the majority of people are still probably looking at a print form newspaper, then what we could probably say is because there are more people accessing the newspaper via a hard copy, the median of 68 is more appropriate. Okay? Now, That line might be moving. The other thing is that a lot of people are consuming news a lot differently nowadays than they were before. Some people are consuming the news on just websites. And lots of times when you're consuming the news on a newspaper, whether it's in a physical hard copy or on a tablet, you have to pay for that product. And a lot of people nowadays try to access that same information for free via websites, like the Winnipeg Free Press website, like cbc.ca, like ctv.ca. So if a lot of people want to access that like younger people for the most part will probably try and access news for free. And people that are used to reading newspapers probably still want to read the newspaper, as in like take a newspaper from a store or a corner store or have it delivered to their home and read it physically rather than looking at it on a tablet. The last question, a school division wants to determine the typical mark in Math Essentials 40S among their schools. The table below shows the data. So each school has a number of students. Each school has a class average. Find the mean and median. Now, to find the mean and median, what we're going to do is we are only going to consider these numbers right here. We're not going to consider the weights here, not yet, not in part A. So we're going to look at those numbers and find the mean and the median. All right? So in order to do that, we do have to write them in order from lowest to highest. So we'll start off with 41. Then we're going to look at 62, 66, and 68. Then we'll look at 70, 72, 74, and 75. And that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 2, 4, 6, 8. That's all of them. So the median is going to be the average of those. So the median, the average of 68 and 70, is 69. That's the median. Now to find the mean, we're going to add them all up and divide by 8. So 41 plus 62 plus 66 plus 68 plus 70 plus 146 plus 75 gives us 528. And we're going to divide that by 8, and we get 66. So the mean is 66. The mean is 66. The median is 69. Now, what's the weighted mean? So the weighted mean is going to be where we take into consideration the number of students at each school. So how are we going to figure that out? Well, what we're going to need to do is we'll need to multiply the number of students by each of the class averages. So we'll start off by taking 18 and multiplying it by 62, and that gives us 1,116. 22 times 41 is 902. 31 times 74 is 2,294. 15 times 66 will be 990. 24 times 75 is 1,800. 9 times 68 is 612. 22 times 72 is 1,584. 16 times 70 is 1,120. So we do need to total all those numbers. and we get 10,418, and we have to divide by the total number of students. And the total number of students would be 157. So we're going to divide 10,418 by 157, and we get a weighted mean of also 66%. So I'm going to put 66.4%. Now, it says to eliminate the outliers. Then, find the new mean and weighted mean. What effect did removing the outlier have? Well, if we take a look at the marks, pretty clear where the outlier is. The outlier is the class average of 41. So, if we want to wipe that, what effect is that going to have? Okay, well, the mean itself will be pretty straightforward because we can just add up all those numbers. So, go ahead and do that here. So if we want to just add those numbers up together, +62 plus 74 plus 66 plus 75 plus 68 plus 72 plus 70, and we divide that by 7, and we get 60, if we round, 70%. So the new mean goes up from 66, that's not what I want, to 70%. As far as the weighted mean goes, well, we can wipe this one, and if we do that, we divide by 135. The weighted mean goes up to 70.5%. So what effect did removing the outlier have? Well, removing the outlier meant that both of the mean and the weighted mean both went up about 4%. So removing the outlier increased the mean and weighted mean by about 4%. So clearly, by getting rid of the outlier, it did have an impact on changing the mean and the weighted mean. And when we're taking a look at data, while we should always take all the data into account, we should ask ourselves a question: does the outlier represent a typical value in the data set? If it does, great. If it doesn't, then we should definitely consider looking at getting rid of it and taking a look at what those measures of central tendency are with it removed. You'll be given an assignment. The assignment is worth marks. It is due when the test is happening. The test will either be Thursday or Friday, and we will talk about that next class.